Okay, welcome everyone to the most recent Business Action Group webinar. And today we're featuring Lori Weiser, who actually came to this group because of the This View of Business collection that we put together. Isn't that right, Lori?
It is, yes, as mentioned in the interview we conducted. I felt like you were eavesdropping.
Yeah, so that's really nice to think that this is actually a product of our group, and she's actually become central very fast, especially with Prosocial, also with her own approach. And so the purpose of this webinar is a little bit broader than some of the previous ones. Lori's going to give us her vision of why business needs an evolutionary perspective, and then we want to end with a discussion that's oriented towards how we can structure our own group to accomplish its goals. So with that, Lori, why don't you take it away? I'm going to put myself on mute, and then I'll be back for the Q&A.
Okay, awesome, thanks. So I first want to thank David for this opportunity to share these ideas with all of you about, what I believe are our strong collective interests in evolution and bringing the power of evolutionary science to the business community. I read through previous webinar decks and I found many common themes, appropriating different elements of evolutionary science to various human and organizational issues. And organizational behavior and evolutionary psychology are two things I'm really passionate about. And I look at both of them maybe a little differently from mainstream marketers or consultants who sort of do what I do for a living. I really look through the lens of evolution, including the field of study, literary Darwinism, and really seek to understand stories and storytelling in the context of evolved and adapted characteristics of human nature. So kind of that's the lens through which I'm sharing these approaches that I think can really add a lot of value to the business community and frankly increase the profile of the Evolution Institute, the Business Action Group, and some initiatives such as Prosocial. So I'm really, really excited to be sharing this with you guys and then having this conversation at the end about how we can make this actionable. So I have a background in anthropology, and I'm continually fascinated by emerging theories about how we evolved, how the mind works as a result of that evolution. And so I usually put this slide up in a client meeting because many people don't really know what anthropology is, and if they do, usually don't have a really clear understanding, of the definition. So if there's any creationists on the phone, which I tend to doubt, please forgive me, but know that I'm not in any way suggesting God and religion have no role to play in discussions about social systems. On the contrary, and that's something that I think is an important consideration when talking to the business community. There's not this really dichotomous approach to bringing evolutionary science into a business environment. So we don't want to be polarizing in a way that suggests that this is an anti-religion stance, because it in fact isn't. One could argue that the three things I want to talk about today have veritable religious application, especially when you talk about cult brands, origin myths, and tribalism. So these are the three ways that I've thought of in a really tangible and concrete manner that would help bring evolutionary science into the business community. So modular mind theory and cult brands, and I'll discuss what I mean by that. Storytelling and origin myths. And I saw some previous work that mentioned this. And then, of course, tribalism and unconscious bias, which I believe is controlling so much of everything today that we can't not have these conversations. Okay, so how do we apply modular theory of the mind and the culting of brands to the business world? Well, first, I want to just define what I mean by modular theory in this context, because I know there are a lot of different theories. And I'm specifically referring to the theory of the mind developed by Douglas Kendrick, in which he sets out 7 modules or systems that often overlap each other. And, in his book, right, he talks about self-protection, mate attraction, retention, affiliation, kin care, status, and disease avoidance. In evolutionary terms, I think we could argue 1 and 2 are the most important, since it is the passing on of genes to the next generation which is most important. And Kendrick posits that no module is the CEO or the boss, no fixed self, no one in charge. And as a result, we shift from module to module easily and often unconsciously. And as I mentioned, it's one of many theories of the mind, but it's one that I think can have a significant impact in the business world, helping people consider their behavior and that of others in a different way, especially when you start thinking about group dynamics. And this is also really helpful when thinking about purchase decision drivers. So nearly every client project of ours deals with purchase consideration, preference, and purchase decision drivers in some way. So when you think about modular mind theory in terms of consumer behavior, Jeffrey Miller really sums it up best, I think, when he says many products are signals first and material objects second. If you take nothing else away from these types of conversations, helping clients understand that these additional dimensions of behavior helps them better align their products and services to market needs. And one of the biggest opportunities for business is understanding that cult isn't a 4-letter word. We can learn a lot from cults. And aren't they little more than super passionate tribes? I mean, at the end of the day. So I think one of the biggest opportunities, is really digging into this idea that cult organizations have a need to separate themselves from the status quo. They must exist outside of norms of culture to appeal to those who feel alienated by those norms, by both recognizing, celebrating potential membership's differences, establishing its own, you're different, but we're different too. Cults by definition establish themselves in these us-them paradigms. And I think the brand that understands and employs cult behavior better than any other is Apple. So their I'm a Mac, I'm a PC campaign really established a powerful us-them construct, because no one wants to be the guy on the left. And I don't know if you remember that campaign, but the other thing they did really well was leverage the social and functional dynamics of the cult to override individual preferences. They're called fanboys today, and this little comic really illustrates what happens when people try to sort of go outside of the accepted, norm. It's a little bit like Scientology, in my opinion. They berate and belittle fellow Apple users who even look in Samsung's direction. And I've gone so far as to call Apple terrorists, as a result. So when you consider why Apple fanboys would be so violently loyal, even in the face of superior, cheaper, open source Android options, I would argue it's largely because the brand lights up a number of important evolutionary needs. And that's why it's the only brand that when it doesn't work, people don't complain. They're actually excited because they get the opportunity to pay a 35% premium for the newest model. It's more like, oh, cool, I can go get the new one now. And so that's a really unprecedented and hard to sustain mind share in the marketplace, but Apple's been able to do it repeatedly. So some of you know I'm a managing partner at Wiser Insights Group, and one of the many proprietary methods we employ to glean consumer insights for our clients is called brand DNA. And brand DNA is what I would call modular mind theory operationalized, because what it does is it looks at the congruity between human characteristics that can describe an individual and can translate to a brand, leveraging some academic research out of UCLA. And so, we've translated it very simply on the right as a brand consideration tool that defines a brand's dominant and core emotional and benefit and allows it to connect with consumers. So here's what that looks like. And this isn't a brand DNA presentation, but it's one example of how we've used principles from evolutionary science to create unique offerings that add value for our clients. So we took that research with this 18,000 personality descriptor words and created an algorithm and query mechanism through, multivariate analytical approach. I don't know how many of you do conjoint analytics and MaxDiff and that kind of stuff, where we can get to a very statistical and tangible way to build this connection with consumers based on what their current brand or their self-perception is, or their aspirational self, and align that with what the brand provides to them. Okay? More on that. If anyone's interested, just hit me up separately because it's actually pretty cool. Okay, so the second way we've identified which evolutionary science can help business is an understanding of the power of storytelling and origin myths. And I look at the power of storytelling through the lens of how we as a species, Homo sapiens, dare I say Homo Ridiculousus, use storytelling as a fundamental tool to solve adaptive problems to get where we are today. I mean, aside from the fact that in today's current political environment, you know, we hear the word tribalism quite frequently, I think we've lost sight of the power of stories to unite or divide groups of people, likely taking that for granted since we're bombarded by data and stories literally 24/7. And I'd like to suggest that our brains aren't wired to handle that onslaught of information. So I wanted to get into this part of the conversation by looking at what one of the greatest storytellers of our time has to say about storytelling. And if you're not familiar with Margaret Atwood, I assure you she has contributed much more to literary history than the Hulu revival of The Handmaid's Tale would lead you to believe. You know, that's really what's put her on the map, which is great, but it's unfortunate because she has such a wealth of historical writing that's incredibly insightful. But she says storytelling is a very old human skill that gives us evolutionary advantage. If you can tell young people how to kill an emu, or that Uncle George was eaten by a croc over there, don't go there to swim, then those young people don't have to find out by trial and error. So there's a powerful functional aspect to storytelling, right? So teaching in this case, specifically teaching how to survive, a primary evolutionary imperative. Well, let's take her example of teaching how to kill an emu and why it's important that young people learn how to kill an emu. Because if they all learn that it's important to kill an emu to survive and how to kill an emu the same way, they can cooperate. And cooperation makes killing the emu easier, so they become more efficient as a group and can secure more food in less time and feed more people. So over time, the continued success through cooperation meant that small bands of people could expand into larger bands because everyone understood the goals. And sapiens could develop tighter and more sophisticated types of cooperation than our cousins, the Neanderthals. But throughout time, we found that where there are people, there are stories. So storytelling is a key to survival. And if at a minimum it can make groups of people more efficient, what else can storytelling really do, especially if we think about its application in the business world? And from an evolutionary perspective, you know, there's a lot of scholarly literature about our ability to talk about fiction that has been called the most unique feature of human language. It's not necessarily just the ability to transmit information about how to kill an emu, what happened to Uncle George, but rather it's the ability to transmit information about things that don't exist. And I find that really, really fascinating. You know, the ability to conceive of and transmit information about things that don't exist. And it turns out our ability to invent and tell stories might be the key adaptation that significantly distinguished our species. Well, you know, why is that? Well, there's a lot that happens in the brain when listening to a story. And, you know, sharing this kind of information with the business community, I think really helps make it tangible that it's not, you know, storytelling or origin myth isn't some abstract construct that's, you know, better left in academia. You know, stories help keep us engaged. They're an important means of communicating with each other. And they serve very, very specific functions. Stories save time. We don't have to jump off a cliff to know what will happen, right? We can simulate it in our minds and kind of understand, so that fiction, that ability to imagine, is kind of a thought experiment in which people can play out these plausible interactions in the world. They save time. Second, they make communication easier. They embed important information about the world. They help us arrange coherent narratives. We have this innate hunger for information, and so stories help us efficiently align information so we can share it. People can make informed decisions. They're often reduced to maxims. You know, early bird gets the worm, bird in the hand, worth two in the bush, that kind of stuff. They really, at the end of the day, just allow us to understand things easier. And that's something that's incredibly leverageable in an organizational environment. And third, stories help us understand and organize our lives. Instead of seeing life as a collection of random events, our ability to look at sequences of events, you know, and weave narrative explanations serve as critical cohabitation and survival aids. And so stories then serve this organizational paradigm and mnemonic device on how to navigate the world, how to navigate a culture, an organizational culture, you know, any type of interaction that includes a group dynamic. So, well, these stories serve a number of purposes. The biggest thing storytelling does in creating fiction is myths, right? This belief in myth, especially origin myths, which are incredibly important to a brand's purpose. And before I get to brand purpose and how important that is, I want to talk about the importance of myths throughout history for just a second. You know, when you start looking at things like David and Goliath, right? Tantalus, Sisyphus, Icarus. Myths are used to teach social taboos and appropriate social behavior. They're used to create behavioral alignment for groups of people. They're used to create and cultivate folklore. And every organization has folklore. And the highest performers and most valuable employees, however you define that, according to those cultural norms of the organization, they understand that folklore, they believe it. And it's foundational. It provides that North Star that everyone can rally around and act as a guide for their individual and collective behavior. It creates those strong social connections. And the need for connection intensifies under stress. And so when organisms are stressed and organizations are stressed, right, they need to be able to revert to a kind of behavior. You know, there's a lot about biomimicry that I absolutely adore, and ants certainly are probably at the top of that list for me, and what ants do in times of distress. And those are things, I kid you not, I used to teach when I was in the business world in onboarding sessions and new hire orientations. That's how important I think they are, and I think the wealth of knowledge of this group is so it's not recognized, it's underutilized in the business community because they don't know these things exist, so they can't possibly understand how to apply them to make organizations more effective. So this idea of creating your company's foundational story, your company's origin myth to organize and galvanize employees is something that we work on as part of our service. Because the difficulty lies not in necessarily crafting the story, but in convincing people to believe it to enable strangers to cooperate. These people on the screen are a tribe. A company is a tribe. And helping organizations understand that in this network of common goals and shared attitudes and values and practices that characterize an institution or organization to create its culture will really, really help people understand how tribe and cult and myth can be leveraged to help bind as a group and move forward in the same direction for continued growth and continued revenue and success. I don't know how many baseball fans there are on the call, but to truly grasp the power of storytelling, something that resonates well in our presentations is really talking about the 2016 Cubs win, becoming a World Series champ for the first time in 108 years. Because the thing that separated this 2016 Cubs team was the dynamic. They were a group of players who were specifically recruited for fit. And it was the first time that had happened, that scouting had been looked at that way, that the chemistry became more important than the technical proficiency or skill. And that's something you're going to hear me talk about in a second in sort of this last idea for how to bring evolutionary science into business. And so there was whole issue of Harvard Business Review, I think this is January, February, double issue, that talks about this culture factor. And in many ways, this Cubs team is a case study on what it takes to build a winning organization. But it's also a lesson in how culture can have an enormous impact on performance and success to build shared vision. So there's a lot of work being done statistically to prove that changing the paradigm to put cultural fit at the top of a hiring strategy increases morale, productivity, retention, et cetera, which I'm going to get to, which is one of the driving factors of the third thing I'm going to talk about in terms of tribalism and unconscious bias with a startup that I'm working on. But before I get there, I just want to touch on something called service CrossChain for a minute. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this, but here again, I can look at this example of Apple that says, you know, culture and storytelling are at the center, and how Apple recruits and trains and even labels their employees, right? They're called geniuses for a reason, but they can't be geniuses unless they're knowledgeable, they're engaged and empowered, and they're engaged and empowered through the use of storytelling and aligning to those stories and those cultures and those beliefs and what that brand is providing. That brand is not just providing cell phones and laptops. They're providing innovation and design and performance and these intangible things that align to what their users want, so that you can build loyal customers who advocate, those fanboys we talked about earlier, to deliver sustained growth and profits. And so without a purpose around which to build and communicate stories, people can't really rally and pull in the same direction toward a common goal. And it sounds really simple and oversimplified, but it's very, very often overlooked, because when we go into a client to start diagnosing, you know, some of the issues and starting to look at building a research plan to generate insights on how to build their business, you know, one of the first questions we ask is, what is the company's purpose? Why do you exist? Can you define your culture? And a lot of times we get, you know, blank, 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 blank. Well, our mission statement is, or our vision is on the wall. But if you can't articulate that, then your employees can't either. And so this, what are they living for? Because financial growth, quarterly performance reports, press releases that go to analysts, that's not a story. That stuff doesn't make anyone work harder, care more, buy one more thing. Stories that describe the company's purpose in making a better world, that helps everyone create, tend to get more people aligned, stories that portray, you know, things and possibilities, which is why salary is almost always near the bottom of employee satisfaction drivers. It's about appreciation of work done, feeling of being involved, being part of something bigger than oneself. So employing storytelling and origin myths can galvanize an organization, but they also require thinking about organizational challenges in a different way. So back to our friend Einstein, where we all go for inspiration and direction, you know, we're familiar with this quote. And when I think about this idea of employing new thinking, I get very excited about another tenet of evolutionary science that can help businesses thrive. And that is, you know, Eleanor Ostrom's work and the whole prosocial movement. Because, you know, she really deconstructed what I'm talking about in the way Einstein suggests, and that is looking at it in a different way, right? Changing the paradigm, flipping it on its head. It's not the people at the top, so far removed from the actual work being done. It's the people who are actually doing the work. And, you know, what's so interesting about the generalized core design principles is that group identity and understanding of purpose is number one, just like cult brands, you know, just like origin myths, folklore, just like high performing cultures. Without that, the other design principles, you know, don't really matter. I would argue you need this strong identity and understanding of purpose, which is exactly what the business action group is trying to do. You know, it needs a logo, it needs a flag, you need t-shirts, you know, that's how people sort of identify and mobilize. And so it's a really, really exciting thing. All right, so the last thing, and then I'll stop talking so that we can all talk together. But tribalism and unconscious bias, and I've chosen the title slide images very specifically. They're all Da Vinci. And I happen to be in the middle of reading Walter Isaacson's biography on Da Vinci because it's fascinating. But I also chose this specific image because I'm going to talk about facial recognition and AI and all these sort of, scary things that are happening right now, sort of this dystopian view of where we're headed, as a species. So tribalism and unconscious bias was something that I started thinking a lot about a year and a half ago, because it is a huge cultural problem. But very, very specifically, I was thinking about it in terms of the failure rate of new hires throughout business. And 50% of new hires fail within the first 18 months. And in doing a lot of research in the past year and a half, it's about an $11 billion problem, just in the US. And there's many reasons for that. Employee engagement, which I believe is at the core of that, right? Which gets back to module 2 of our discussion today, origin myth and all that stuff. So there's an $11 billion problem out there. And what we found is the majority of new hires fail due to personality issues, not lack of skills. So this is sort of statistically proving that Cub's approach to assembling a team, it's not the lack of technical skill. It's not these other things. If you look at the stuff in green, it's all about attitude and temperament. So we started thinking a lot about why are companies great at evaluating skills and bad at evaluating temperament. We believe unconscious bias is at that core, because what's happening is people are recruiting based on a very narrow definition of the tribe as it currently exists inside the organization. So it's real and it's hardwired, and it's largely uncontrollable, even for the most well-meaning individuals. So vetting candidates based on skill set, what they do is they go through online and they look at their social profiles and LinkedIn photos, and they try to determine, does that person look like they'd fit? And they start assigning all kinds of subjective attributes within seconds of viewing it. So while all the new hires might consistently have acceptable skill sets, half of them don't have the temperament to be successful in that job, in that culture, in that environment, with that tribe, at the department level, at the organizational level, interfacing with the C-suite, whatever it is. And so those are the things we think are really, really important to look at in hiring. But first, you have to give people sort of a pressure valve and an understanding of unconscious bias. This idea that it's not entirely your fault that these things are happening. So how do you change the conversation? Well, don't ask recruiter, hiring manager, etc., does this person have 7-8 years relevant experience? Ask instead, can this person integrate, facilitate, communicate, cooperate, collaborate, these attributes, these behaviors that are critically important to success in group dynamics? Don't approach the resources from a risk management perspective. And I can talk an hour about even calling people resources is part of the fundamental problem and why there's such a high failure rate. And don't look at them as in terms of employee relations, benefits, compliance from this legal point of view. Ask instead, how do we lead in a way that unleashes individual and collaborative creativity, polycentric governance, prosociality, latent altruism? How do we change the conversation in a business environment? And we believe it all starts with recruitment and hiring, which is why I'm working on co-founding this company called YouScore, because we believe you can judge a book by its cover. You just need better, more objective tools to do so. And so we believe that there is a way to go about employing cutting-edge facial recognition as long as you program in a way that takes into account all of these variables of unconscious bias and all of these other things that influence human behavior. And so we've built this predictive model called the Moat Edge, overlaying these unique facial attributes predictive of important behavioral traits, and then went back to academic research and attributed the decision making throughout the algorithm to these different foundational studies to come up with our own proprietary model for likability, trustworthiness, and confidence, the most powerful attributes for making all of these connections and collaborations and, group success possible. And so just briefly taking you through, again, just showing how we believe there's so much opportunity to bring evolutionary science into this conversation, uploading photos, going through an algorithm, generating a report, looking at all this scientific data that's objective, and then ranking candidates, not only in the absolute of their own scores, but how they rank relative to others who are at the same level or same number of years of experience or in the same job category. So I don't want to kind of bore you with the details of this, but there's even a further step. So once you start this foundation of looking for companies that fit personality and fit the culture, you then start building a database that gets you to a place where you can now doing custom culture profiles per employer, back to brand DNA at the company level, and doing this matching system that's really predicated on the predictors of success as opposed to the arbitrary and subjective attributes that people assign today based on the very narrow view of existing people in the organization. Getting to a more diverse company composition. This is not diversity in the traditional sense. This is the actual composition, which then will require even more prosocial understanding, because now it looks different from my tribe. Now there's stuff that's foreign. There are diverse points of view that I can't consider or have not to this point been able to consider, because that person or those people bring this very different collective point of view from this different foreign, tribe into this conversation. We believe that if you combine this way of recruiting and hiring with intensive prosocial development, that you'll have much more long-term employment success, which will lead in service profit chain to much greater advocacy and continued growth. There's a whole body of work on firms of endearment and conscious capitalism that prove this out, that when companies and individuals who work there are aligned to the purpose, that it shows greater measures of meaningfulness and, year over year compound general growth rates for 15 and 20 years beyond a control group. So if anyone's interested in that, I encourage you, to check that out. But all of this was sort of taken into consideration to sort of develop this idea, and it's called YouScore, and I'll show you that logo in a second. But because the job seeker's dilemma is that they're sort of not getting chosen even to get to the table to have a conversation because they don't look the part. And all they have to rely on is the subjective and biased friends and family network. And the recruiter's reality is they're using social media and they're scanning these photographs, and they don't have time. They're overworked. It's a saturated labor market. And so YouScore exists to try to level the playing field by quickly and objectively identifying candidates who have the greatest likelihood of success based on more unbiased data. So there's YouScore, and that's what we're embarking on as we speak, which is, again, why I'm very, very excited that, David has put this group together. And a year and a half ago, when we were sort of envisioning, the foundation of YouScore, is when this view of business came across my email because I subscribed to the newsletter, and I had this incredible epiphany moment that said, oh my gosh, somebody was eavesdropping on all of our conversations, because this is real, and this can be real, and it can be very, very powerful. So to that end, I see it as this opportunity to develop this ecosystem where we sort of align and mobilize on value creation for revenue generation, not only for businesses or entities of which we have interest in helping, but also to generate revenue for the group and the Evolution Institute. So start by developing a plan to increase business understanding of the value of evolutionary thinking, increase the profile of the Evolution Institute and Business Action Group, and those of us as vehicles also, and vessels to distribute and disseminate this type of information, and then monetize and sell content to generate results to merchandise to business. So I know that was really, really fast with a lot of information, but I wanted to sort of give you 3 what I feel are very tangible ways that we're doing it today, in our organization, and say, bring this group together to say, how do we use evolution as the passport? How does this conversation get us to better brand strategy and defining purpose and storytelling and prosociality and biomimicry and all of these types of things? And so I say, okay, so now what? Now that I've been talking for, 35 minutes or whatever it is, how do we organize and mobilize? How do we talk about what I feel is sort of this embarrassment of riches at our feet, that we have this wonderful thing to bring out into the business world? How do we do that in a way that's structured and organized and makes sense, that everyone can be part of and can contribute to and can create a real appreciable difference in, the businesses of tomorrow? So that is my story, folks. Really grateful to have this platform, to have this conversation, and look forward to hearing thoughts and how we can work together.
Well, that was awesome. It's David Wilson coming back in, and so happy that we have a good group to listen to you, Laurie. You're a sizable fraction of our business action group. There's so much that I could be saying in response to this, but I'm actually going to hold my tongue because I have a feeling that others will have a lot to say too. I think there's, just to make a few points, I think the 4 webinars that we have so far are by themselves an incredibly rich resource for fleshing out this business from an evolutionary perspective. And there's much to say about your talk, Laurie, but also there's this prospect of what do we do to mobilize. And I think that if we can begin that conversation now and then find ways to continue it, I mean, we should be very self-supporting in what we do. And if we can't do it, being having so many members that are so business oriented, then I don't know who could. So anyhow, let me open the floor for others, and then I might come back in with some comments, but I'm eager to have other people do some talking. It's impossible that others don't have something to say, knowing all of you.
I have something to say. I'll jump in if no one else.
Now they're all talking at once. Go ahead.
Okay, I was actually going to try and develop my question a little more, but I'll just bust it out there. Loved the talk, loved the piece about storytelling. I would just, as a very brief aside, based on my own experience, I think there's such power in storytelling at the individual level as well, not just at the organizational level, but this really is a part of our cognitive toolkit that we need to maximize more about ourselves and our organization. So just very briefly, I just wanted to say, love the storytelling part of the talk. When you say, talk about the value of evolutionary thinking to businesses, I think a lot of businesses have piecemeal, whether it's been explicitly or otherwise, they've piecemeal delved into bits and pieces of evolutionary thinking here and there. But I think what we need essentially is to convince businesses that these aren't just discrete instances where evolutionary theory applies here and there. It's actually a meta-theoretical foundation for understanding business in general. So, I mean, you've talked about how we can use evolutionary insights to better inform recruitment and hiring practices and so forth. I mean, you know, that is such a powerful, powerful insight that I think so many business people would just be spellbound by, you know, and yet retrospectively they might also think, well, it should have been obvious all along. But yeah, I think for me the value of evolutionary thinking and how we broadcast it more widely is going to be to convince businesses that this is a meta-theoretical foundation. So yeah, that was my slightly undeveloped question there, or observation rather.
Well, that corresponds to a major point that I want to make, and I think I have made in previous webinars, which is that so often you hear that with businesses you have to appeal as fast as possible to the bottom line, and yet what we really need to do is to convey this cosmology, this meta theory, as Gareth just described it, and basically to get them as excited about the evolutionary worldview as we are. And I think that's possible. I know based on my conversations with more than one of you, I hear, yeah, I mean, that can happen. You can do that. But Laurie, what's your view on that? The need to appeal to the bottom line, and yet at the same time, the need to convey an entire worldview.
Yeah, I mean, David, I think you know, I believe firmly there always has to be some end in sight, right? So therefore, that, you know, the business community is much less tolerant of spending an hour on a webinar waxing poetic about an evolutionary worldview without some end in mind. So I think it's a balance, and I think building very tangible tools, like we've done with brand DNA, like we're doing with YouScore, is how you know, do that, putting very specific you know, problem solution type constructs in front of them, and how various evolutionary theories can help solve those problems. But I think the bigger thing for me is widening the aperture with this group to say, you know, to your point, there's a wealth of knowledge and talent and content and resource here. How do we increase the profile? It's almost like a PR campaign for evolutionary thinking, you know, a PR campaign that says this is a meta-theoretical foundation for improving business. And then having tools, you know, like I said, brand DNA, YouScore, are tangible examples of how to do that, how to improve business, that bottom line piece.
Yeah, and if we can do that, then it'll be in time for the Academy of Management meetings, where we're planning not just to have a single session, but to really publicize, do exactly what you say. You might call it a PR campaign, beginning at the major society, at this major society meeting.
Hi, Laurie. This is Donna Reed speaking. And what you're talking about speaks very closely to what's in my heart and my mind and in my own research. And my research is really focused around implicit emotion and how that gets triggered within a team environment and affects team behaviors, and how the prosocial model can actually help to alleviate all of that and build engagement, retention, heightened performance, and all of those other good things within the team itself. My background is international foreign assistance. And among the things that I've done in that industry is to build a recruitment system for an international development firm in Vermont. And the problems that we have in there in building our teams is that we are recruiting against very specific criteria that come from the donors, and also against very, very tight timeframes. So we end up throwing teams together that fit the criteria. They get out into the field and they can't function. And we also have very poor leadership and very little leadership training. Normally people are just sort of promoted up from the technical sectors into leadership positions, and that just leads to a total mess. And I think that what you're doing here with this type of recruitment is extremely important for us, as it is, I think, for every industry. And I'm really fascinated to hear about it and to learn much, much more about it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, it's funny you say that, Donna, because we do talk a lot with YouScore about implicit memory and explicit memory, and even something as simple as viewing the image on the LinkedIn profile. It reminds me of, you know, my ex-boyfriend and I hate him, right? It's those unconscious feelings that we can't control. But people in a human resource environment or recruiters who are, you know, trying to fill positions, they're not educated on unconscious bias and implicit memory and emotion. They don't understand that is a dimension that is affecting how they're looking at these variables, people being the variables, you know, and there's a part of that, you know, to your point about how important it is that just getting them to understand it, right? As you know, every 12-step problem, knowing is the first step, you know, getting them to understand that there are these factors at play that are part of our human condition. So love to, you know, talk more about that and how to make more people aware so that they can embrace, you know, that this, when you say the word evolution, it's not evolution versus Jesus, you know, everybody stop it, you know. It's a much broader application of evolutionary science.
Yeah, you just made me think of something that I hadn't thought of before. And a lot of this starts with the recruiting of recruiters and the training of recruiters when they're recruited, because people tend to think that you can hire anybody off the street and tell them, okay, go recruit. And that's not true, you know?
Well, one of the messages that comes through here, in many different contexts, is that it needs to be a tribe, but the tribe needs to be composed of people that no one would ever assemble as a tribe based on their tribal instincts. So that's why in the normal recruiting process, when people select others that will just fit in, they're not actually creating the right group from that perspective. So the group has to be diverse, and that's typically not what would be assembled, and then they have to be turned into a tribe. So it's actually quite a tricky piece of social engineering to do that, to compose a group of people that ordinarily would never be assembled, and then to have them function like a tribe.
That's right. It's anti-tribal, David, which is why prosocial seems to be an element to get them to that tribal state, of course, with storytelling and origin myth, and the reason that they can all bond to, that why they're all there working together.
Yeah, and the core of that is shared purpose.
Correct.
Yes, the core is shared purpose and identity. That's what the prosocial process does. Max has texted that he has a question. So Max, are you there?
I am indeed. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks a lot for your talk, Laurie. That was, incredibly thought-provoking, and I definitely, you've connected ideas we haven't really thought about before, so it was really refreshing and a fantastic presentation. I had 2 points. I think we've touched on the second point in terms of the diversity versus group cohesion thing, but I'll get on to that. But my first question was really about YouScore. So I found that definitely intrigued by that and the technology you've developed. Initially, through your presentation, I interpreted it as a form of physiognomy, as in you were trying to predict people's personalities from their face, which it sounds like you're not trying to do that. If anything, you're trying to do the reverse. But can you just clarify what exactly you're measuring and how it works with YouScore? And then my second question, if I can be cheeky and ask the second one, was really just about this aspect of cultural fit, right? It's I think, as I say, David, I think has nailed it, and really I think we all concur. But it's a balancing act where you want cohesion, you want an element of tribalism, but at the same time, especially in the intellectual domains and corporations, when there's decision making being involved, you want a level of dissent, and you want to bring people in which do not have typical characteristics of the group necessarily, because that's where a lot of value can be offered. So really just your reflections on that as well.
Yeah, sure. So your first question, Max, I think is best handled offline in email, and I can certainly share that with others because it's quite intricate to explain how the application works. But suffice it to say, it's not necessarily a straight personality model. Now, we looked at 5-factor originally as part of what we were doing, and instead decided that since behavior is contextual, it made a lot more sense to look at some specific attribution of academic literature around the face. And Todorov's work, it was based largely on some of Todorov's work and Kaczynski's work out of Stanford, and the Glasgow Unfamiliar Faces database about the amygdala and the ability to determine trustworthiness, within a nanosecond and that kind of thing. So I can, give you a much richer, in-depth understanding of that, offline.
No, absolutely. Just to clarify though, are you advising people what their profile, the signals their profile they're giving to employers, or are you giving advice on employers how to select candidates from the profiles itself? Or is it both?
That is such an excellent question. We had originally thought we would go direct to consumer about signaling, because that's essentially what it is, right? And decided that there was greater value going directly to businesses, because we don't want people to try to quote unquote game the system, right?
Yeah.
To try to improve or change their signal. And we landed, and this was a good 8 months of debate. So it's funny you went to the heart of sort of that issue that we were wrestling with. That we decided that there's much greater value in the authenticity and objectivity of the current manifestation, because that's probably the most accurate. Now, the consumer will be informed of their YouScore. Here's kind of what you're saying, how likable, trustworthy, and confident you are, and here's how you look relative to others looking for a job in marketing, information technology, human resources, etc. But at the end of the day, it's not about gaming the system and uploading more photos and paying for each one to be, so you can kind of put your best foot forward. And we did a lot of thinking about that and why we decided, no, it's really about organization, because we're trying to get through, we know you need an element of tribalism, but that element of tribalism should be based on these attributes and not how the person looks. So getting more people who don't look like the current narrow landscape inside the organization to the table for the interview is where we decided to focus and could have the greatest impact and value to both candidates and employers, frankly.
Okay. Sorry, David.
If I could just insert before, Laura, you address Max's second question. I've often, based on many conversations with you, I think it's important to distinguish between kind of the technological aspects. How much can you actually discern from a facial image, for example, and the purpose behind that, the kind of people you're trying to recruit. If it turns out that it's difficult to do that based on the information in a facial image, then there's other ways to do it. So I think it's important to separate the sort of technological aspects of YouScore from its underlying objectives.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, as you and I have discussed, people on this phone probably aren't privy to, we had ways to identify predictors of things such as ethnicity and age, things that are used as discriminators today, and remove them from the models. And that was really important for us, so that, the models weren't having these implicit factors that are used today as discriminators. So, suffice it to say, yes, you can separate those two, but we feel like we've already done that, but that doesn't preclude us from exploring other ways to try to meet that underlying goal than through the use of technology, or specifically this type of technology using facial recognition. So I hear you. And Max, remind me, what was your second question again?
Well, it was more, as I said, I think we've covered it really, so maybe maybe
okay.
want to discard
I thought we
it. It was just a point about cultural fit, right? I was just basically challenging that idea that you do also arguably need, especially in intellectual and domains where it's about decision making, you need people that think differently than other people. So you need to be, yes, you want a level of tribalism, but at the same time there is a lot of benefit of bringing people which are not unlike not alike to other group members. So just
Yeah.
your thoughts on
Yeah.
that and how you kind of integrate that balancing act into
Yeah,
what you're doing.
we feel that's more important than anything, and we feel that the cultural fit piece comes in with the foundational origin story and storytelling, because if you fundamentally have to be able to communicate the purpose and the behaviors that are rewarded in order to then identify that cultural fit. And today, people largely just point, well, our values are on the wall. No, that's not your culture. The poster in the break room is not your culture. And so that's kind of the first step in cultural fit.
Right. Myri has a question.
Okay.
Let's see, Myri, are you unmuted?
I'm trying to.
There you go. There you are.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Sorry, it still says I'm muted. Hi, Laurie. That was a brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. So interesting. My question is about the difference between the genders. In terms of creating a tribe of people that are going to work well together, how can we help women be more of that tribe? We know that men have evolved to be more inclined to form coalitions to kind of fight against the group outside. So how can we help women be part of the tribe? Because we hear all the time about women having trouble networking, being heard in meetings, being able to speak out. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I haven't thought about it a lot, honestly. I did read Lean In, which sort of irritated me a bit. I don't know if you've read it, but I think, part of YouScore's goal is to do that, right, in a way that brings people who, we've been calling them the chronically marginalized, and somewhat through no fault of their own, right, unconscious bias, the way they look, gender certainly plays a role in that. But getting people to the table, to us, was where we singly focused, which by removing gender should theoretically get more women to the interview. But as far as helping more women be part of the tribe, it's cultural programming. Our culture has evolved much, much faster than our evolutionary adaptations. And so that's a pretty tall order,
Yeah.
The historic gender roles, those are to a certain extent hardwired also. Mm-hmm. And it takes time. I do think, with a lot of movements about acceptance, body positivity, acceptance, inclusion, you see women now who it's more popular and acceptable to have, shaved hair, and even younger kids, which is fascinating to me. They're breaking through some of those boundaries and stereotypes and traditional roles, and putting out different signals. Again, I think the wrapping paper, though, for me, is still evolutionary theory. It's still the idea of the meta-theoretical foundation of understanding our behavior. So you can't have a conversation about helping women be part of the tribe, Sheryl Sandberg, without having a conversation about evolutionary theory.
Yeah. I think it's really important to take into account, the differences. But I'm just wondering how, not necessarily recruiting more women, but how to, go about getting women to feel more integrated in the group.
Yeah, I think some of the ACT matrix is probably extremely useful to that end. But go ahead, David.
I think that, and this will be, we need to end in just a minute or two, but I think it's implicit in Laurie's talk and in the other webinars that two things are going on that seem opposed to each other, yet are not. One is the EP side of things with its modules and its kind of, that evolved during the distant past. And we could be thinking about sex differences in that way. And by definition, those are not going to change soon. And yet at the same time, we have the storytelling, we have the Skinnerian processes, an act which allows a lot more flexibility in the norms that we create and the stories that we tell. And the latter, the open-ended part, can do a lot to ameliorate the former. So there's really no reason why you can't have a culture supported by the right kinds of stories that portray women as equal, so on and so forth, and actually provide a series of norms that work against the evolved predispositions. And in fact, that's what norms always do. It's almost the nature of norms, is that they work against, it's the nature of morality, that it works against evolved predispositions. So getting the right combination of acknowledging the importance of these evolved modules, which do exist, and yet at the same time being able to work with them in order to create modern systems that do what we want, in this case to have gender equality. This is something that's possible, but it's something that needs to be socially engineered. Now, let me wrap up because I don't want to be too late. First of all, to thank everybody for yet another sparkling experience, and also to say that the idea of structuring our own group, we didn't quite address in this webinar, but I think I want to do so, and not to wait for the next webinar, but rather to initiate something on Slack or and to start to think about what we can do to be more powerful as a group, and also more visible and more self-sustaining. I think that's such an important thing to do. So, Laurie, would you like the last word?
Just to say thanks to everyone for participating, and David, thank you for providing this platform to get us together, and look forward to that next conversation that you just mentioned, because I think it can be some breakthrough, whether it's publication or marketing, or that really will make a difference in the world. And at the end of the day, I kind of that's what we're all here for. So thank you.
How very pro-social of us all. Okay, folks, thanks so much, and we'll see you next time, and we'll also see you on Slack. See you later.